The COVID-19 pandemic is hurting meat production in the United States, exposing shortcomings in the country's supply chain. In the past month, some of the country's biggest meat producers have closed processing plants after workers became infected. Smithfield, the world's biggest pork processor, shut 2 of its plants, accounting for almost 8% of U.S. production. Tyson Foods, the biggest U.S. meat company, has closed at least 2 plants, and its chairman has warned of looming meat shortages. John Tyson says millions of kilos of meat will disappear from the food supply chain. So what's happening in the U.S. could have an impact globally. America is the world's second biggest pork exporter. Last year, it shipped almost 3 million tons, more than mainland China and Hong Kong's imports. And the U.S. was also the world's second biggest exporter of chicken last year and the number 4 supplier of beef. So how will this impact us in Asia? Last year, Asia bought more than 2 million tons of beef and pork from the United States, worth almost $10 billion. And that's more than 60% worth of total U.S. meat exports. In Asia, the biggest buyers of U.S. pork is China at over 650,000 tons last year. Japan was the second biggest buyer, followed by South Korea. Now, as for U.S. beef, Japan topped Asia as the biggest buyer last year. It imported over 300,000 tons of the meat, worth almost $2 billion. And next comes South Korea, followed by mainland China and Hong Kong. The disruption in the U.S. has led to beef and pork prices surging. U.S. wholesale beef has surged to a record, and wholesale pork soared almost 30% last week. So for a closer look, we're joined by Andrew Cox. He's General Manager of International Markets at Meat and Livestock Australia. Andrew, thanks for joining us. So big question, will the U.S. have to cut exports to make up for production shortfall domestically?
Yeah, well, obviously we've got an unprecedented situation within what was already an unprecedented situation now in the US with meat supply. As you say, production is down 30-40% at the moment, and supply is also will be limited. But the question of whether the US will need to limit their exports, I think, is firstly highly difficult to answer. We need to remember that while supply is down, the demand is also down. The airlines aren't flying, the hotels are closed, and many, of course, food service establishments are also closed. So the market in the US has a lot of latent demand as well, demand missing from the market due to COVID-19. Also, the US is a smaller exporter. Whilst it's a huge supplier and a huge market within itself, the US only exports 10 to 25% of their beef and pork products. And also today, the government made measures to shore up production by signing an executive order, which should help plants remain open in the short to medium term.
So what does that mean for us here in Asia then? How does this affect us? Are we likely to see this translate into higher prices?
I think it's too hard to tell. The majority of product that the US produces is kept domestically, and at the same time, the majority of product that we consume throughout Asia is from elsewhere, both our own domestic production in different countries, but also from other places like Australia for beef, and for pork and chicken from other places in South America, Europe, and elsewhere. So it's certainly too early to tell. But I don't forecast any significant supply disruption at an overall basis across Asia. Certainly, Japan and Korea and some other North Asian markets do have a heavier reliance on American pork and beef within their imports and their supply chain. But as I said, there always is other sources for this type of product, and it constitutes just a minority of the overall consumption in these markets.
All right, Andrew, so how will Australia then position itself to deal with whatever potential disruptions there may or may not be?
So thankfully, touch wood, infections of COVID-19 in Australia are down to around single figures. From the meat perspective, our processing capacity has not been impacted, so the plants are still open. Australia always is export focused and Asia focused. We export more than 70% of our beef export, and most of that goes to Asia. The supply chain is functioning, so there were some hiccups, of course, with China, with air freight, with planes being grounded. But for the most part, that has been alleviated. We also had panic buying, which disrupted the supply chain, but that seems to have been alleviated. So the supply chain is functioning quite well. And when it comes to prices that people can expect, I think it's kind of there's a bit of a dichotomy existing because all those hotels are closed and the airlines are closed. People may have the ability to buy products that they never used before, the high value products that they otherwise can only get from the steakhouse and the hotel.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for speaking to us. We've been speaking to Andrew Cox, General Manager of International Markets at Meat and Livestock Australia.